Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Sharp, and I'm the current president of the board for the First Unitarian Congregation of Ottawa. Our community has a long history of standing up for global justice issues around the world. In fact, one of our first tenants and community partners in our current building in the 1960s was Amnesty International. Our Global Justice Action Group has many ongoing projects, and they regularly invite guests to help raise our awareness about current issues in the world. As Unitarians, we say something when we have concerns, whether it is about a local, national, or international issue. Our principles and values call us to shine the light on situations where the human rights of marginalized groups are not being respected, whether it's in Canada or in other countries. As well, our values mandate that we provide a safe space for our guests and for our participants today. So we're going to follow some extra protocols this morning to address questions from the audience. Our speaker will be giving us a presentation for about 25 to 30 minutes, and we will be taking questions through the chat at the end of the presentation. If you think of any questions, please write them into your chat messages and send them to me, Lisa Sharp. I will then pass on selected questions to the speaker once it's time for the questions to happen. We ask that all questions and comments be respectful and civil. At around 10 a.m., the recording will be stopped, and then there will be a chance for informal questions and discussion. At that time, you will be able to unmute yourself and raise your hand if you wish to ask a question out loud. Now, I'd like to introduce our special guest, Dr. Peter Larson. Peter has been a guest speaker at our congregation on many occasions over the years. Peter is the chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, OFIP, a Canadian human rights organization focusing on the Middle East. His professional career included periods at the Public Policy Forum, the Conference Board of Canada, and the French language daily Le Droit. Over the past 10 years, he has led many trips to the Middle East for Canadians who are interested in gaining a deeper understanding of the complex Israel-Palestine issue. He is a frequent lecturer for different churches and labor groups, retiree associations, and service clubs. His presentations are appreciated for being thoughtful and fact-based. He has a PhD in political economy from Université Pierre Mendès, France, in Grenoble, France. In 2012, he was awarded the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal by the Governor General of Canada in recognition of his educational work on Canada-Arab relations. He lives in Ottawa with his wife, Lorraine. They have 2 adult children and 4 grandchildren, all of whom, unfortunately, live far away from Ottawa. The floor, if we have a floor in Zoom, is yours, Peter.
Unmute. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lisa, to all of you. Glad to be here this morning. Can you hear me okay? Can you nod if you can hear okay? All right, that's great. I once had someone introduce me saying that I had received from the hands of the Governor General this Queen's Jubilee Award, and I had to disabuse them of that notion. Actually, it was just mailed to me. I didn't really get it from the hands of the Governor General. I'm going to make a presentation for you this morning, a PowerPoint presentation. As I say, as Lisa said, it will probably last 20, 25 minutes. It's probably better if you note your questions down, and I can try to deal with them at the end. So let me just see if I can share screen properly. Share screen from the beginning. Lisa, are you seeing it properly? Or can somebody give me an indication that it is being seen properly?
Peter.
Okay, terrific. Okay. So the question that I want to address this morning is, why does the UN always single out Israel for criticism? This is a comment that's sometimes said kind of wistfully. And so I wanted to sort of tackle this, this issue this morning and try to give my explanation of why I think this phenomenon is the case. Before I made once I accepted my invitation, I decided I'd go on the website and make sure I knew what I was talking about. So I looked up the principles of the Unitarian congregation, all of which I feel quite comfortable with. And three of your principles, if I've understood them correctly, I think actually pertain quite a bit to the topic and to the presentation this morning. The second principle, dealing with justice and equity and compassion in human relations. And I think that's extremely important. And I think compassion in particular is in short supply. And I even have to say, sometimes short supply on both sides in this issue. The fourth principle, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. I have tried to do that. I think that's an important principle to maintain. And of course, the goal of world community with peace and liberty. So I think it's quite relevant. And I hope at the end of my presentation, you will feel that I've respected your principles. Let me just first of all deal with the question, is it true that the UN criticizes Israel more than any other state? And that absolutely is true. You have some numbers on your screen here today. These are from some General Assembly resolutions. So look, going back 8 years, although it's a pattern that goes back a lot longer than that. I didn't need to show you back farther than that. But for example, in the year 2012, there were 22 resolutions at the General Assembly criticizing Israel and 4 relating to the rest of the world. 2020, 17 relating to Israel, and only 6 relating to the rest of the world. So out of this document I get from the Jewish Virtual Library, out of this, it's true that the UN criticized Israel more than other states, and these are only resolutions at the General Assembly. Israel also is criticized in a number of other UN bodies in roughly the same proportion, although it's not true that the UN only votes against Israel. In fact, sometimes Canada gets slammed by the United Nations as well. This one I picked up off the Toronto Star. I think it probably had to do with our relations with Canada's Indigenous peoples. The UN votes are important in the sense that they are a reflection of world opinion, but they also have to be taken with a certain grain of salt because it's political theater. Take, for example, this vote in 1975 when the UN voted 72 to 35 to term Zionism as a form of racism. I say grain of salt because a lot of the countries who voted in favor of that resolution practice racism in their own countries against their own minorities at the same time. In fact, this particular one was reversed in 1991. So voting at the UN or speaking at the UN is sometimes a way to cover up your other sins. In fact, a number of the countries that are most vocal in their criticisms of Israel, neighboring Arab countries, often under the table do business with Israel, do security coordination with Israel, and so on and so forth. So the voting itself, I'm not saying it is of no significance, it is of significance, but it needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Now, why would it happen that there is so much focus on Israel at the United Nations? And I think to understand this, you really have to take a long detour back to think about why the UN created Israel in the first place, why it voted in 1947 to partition Palestine and facilitate the creation of a Jewish state. And that relates to the very long and sad, tragic history of anti-Semitism in Europe. I've done a lot of research in this area, and I was surprised when I learned, for example, that Jews were expelled from various European countries as early as 1,000 years ago. The first crusade, which went from France to the Holy Land, paraded through Germany and what is now Yugoslavia, massacring Jews on the way. Jews were expelled from England in 1290. Jews were expelled, as we know, from Spain in 1492, along with the Muslims. There have been ghettos in Italy and so on. So for some reason, Christianity has had a particular antipathy towards Jews, both Catholics and Protestants, by the way, in a way that is not replicated anywhere else in the world. There's nothing comparable to the expulsions, the pogroms in the Hindu world in the Muslim world. In fact, when Jews were expelled from Spain by the Christian kings, when Spain became a Christian country, Jews and Muslims were expelled, and many Jews went to the Muslim areas of the world, to the Maghreb, to Egypt, to the Ottoman Empire, because they were safer there. In fact, the Ottoman Sultan welcomed the Jews to come and bring your doctors and your lawyers and so on. So there's this very long history, sad, atrocious history of anti-Semitism in Europe. And it started to grow, particularly at the end of the 19th century, especially in Eastern Europe, with Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, Poland, pogroms. It was a terrible oppression of Jews, and Jews reacted to it in different ways. A lot of them emigrated to America. There was a big wave of Jewish emigration to America in the 1880s, 1850s to 1880s. Some Jews reacted by trying to assimilate, by changing their names from Jewish names to French names or Austrian names or German names, and basically hiding their Jewishness as a way of protection. Some Jews thought that the best way to protect themselves was through a socialist revolution, to overthrow the czars and the feudal regimes. And so you will know that many of the early leaders of the socialist movement in Europe, from Karl Marx, Trotsky, and so on, were Jews. Some Jews reverted into fundamentalism, sort of closing down, becoming more Jewish and trying to withdraw from society. But there also arose this notion of Zionism, and that was the fifth reaction of Jews to their terrible oppression in Europe. And Zionism was the notion that the Jews needed a state of their own. First of all, it wasn't clear where the state was going to be, but eventually Theodor Herzl and others landed on Palestine as an area where Jews might go for their own protection. The Zionist movement was a minority phenomenon amongst Jews at first, but after the Holocaust, it became a dominant view. So European anti-Semitism culminated in the Holocaust. I don't need to spend much time on this horrible event in history that you're all very familiar with. It started off as a desire to ethnically cleanse Germany by expelling the Jews, and then it finally moved to an unfortunately terribly named final solution, which ended up with the murder of more than 6 million Jews and another 9 million people designated as being undesirable. Now, the problem after the war was that European countries were looking for a solution to the Jewish problem, and Canada was with its European neighbors. There was horror and shame and guilt over the Holocaust, over the fact not only that what had happened, but that we hadn't really done anything to protect it. On the other hand, and this is not to Canada's credit, we didn't want the Jews to come here. Americans didn't want the Jews to go there. You will remember the story of the St. Louis. Just before the war, this tragic ship, desperately filled with Jews, desperately trying to escape the Holocaust, refused entrance to Canada, sent back to Europe, where I think more than half of them were killed. But even in the 40s and early 50s in Canada, there was still a considerable amount of anti-Semitism. So there's an article about Queen's University, which limited the Jewish enrollment in the university. So we have a situation where the Jews were desperate for a solution, but nobody wanted them. And in that context, the Zionist solution, the idea of a homeland for Jews in Palestine, started to gain real traction. It not only was attractive to Jews, but it became an attractive solution to Europeans, because it seemed like a European solution to the European problem was to have them go somewhere else. And so the UN, which was at that time largely a European organization, adopted the Zionist idea to give the Jews a country in part of Palestine. And a resolution took place at the UN on 1947, November 29th, 1947, to divide Palestine, which you see on the right here, into two parts, a Jewish state and an Arab state. And it was you see, look at the voting summary there, 33 voted for, 13 against, 10 abstained. That gives about 50 members altogether. The UN at that time was basically a European organization, European countries plus Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand, and so on and so forth. Of course, today there are 4 times as many members of the United Nations. The problem was that while they voted to give more than half of the Palestine to basically to European Jews, it wasn't empty. There were already 1.5 million people living in Mandate Palestine, and this became a new problem. So what happened after the vote? Well, to have a Jewish state, the Jews had to be in the majority. But at the time of the vote, they were only 1/3 of the population. So how do you turn a minority into a majority? And there are really only 2 possible ways of doing so. One is to encourage the people who live there to leave, to go somewhere else. And the other is to recruit as many more Jews as possible to come and become citizens of the new state. And starting the day after the UN vote, armed Zionist militias started pushing the Palestinians out. And over the next 1.5 years, 750,000 were expelled or fled, and they left all their possessions behind. I say all their possessions, you can see some people carrying bags, but most of their possessions they had to leave behind. Ben-Gurion, who was the head of the Jewish Agency, they publicly welcomed the UN plan, but in fact, they went way beyond its provisions. You'll see on the map on the left-hand side here, there are 2 maps on the left-hand side of the screen. The white is what was proposed by the UN as a new Jewish state on the far left side. And then in the next map over, you can see what it became. So the white became considerably larger than what the UN had proposed. And that took place as these Palestinians were expelled. And then on the map on the right-hand side, you can see that the Palestinian refugees fled to Gaza, they fled to Jordan, they fled to the West Bank. Basically, they fled wherever they could flee to. Jewish forces also took over a number of areas which the UN had not allocated to the new Jewish state. The most important of them was Jerusalem. Jerusalem was physically, this is a map, this is a blow up of this map here. That's the official UN partition plan. And this is a blow up of that segment there. You can see that Jerusalem was to be physically located in the middle of the Arab state, but it was to be an international city, a bit like Berlin was under international auspices. Neither Jewish nor Arab, neither Christian nor Muslim or Jewish. And also you see on the left-hand side there where it says Arab, the city of Jaffa was also to be part of the new Arab state. But the Jewish forces took over Jaffa. They pushed the Palestinians out of there, and they also took over 1/3 of Jerusalem, took over what's now called West Jerusalem, in defiance of what the UN proposal had been. So how did the UN react to all this? Well, I think many people were surprised, and the UN passed a resolution in 1948 on the right of return, basically saying that the Palestinian refugees who wished to return to their homes peaceably could do so at the earliest practicable date. That's Resolution 194 on December 11th, 1948. And you can see 35 voted for, 15 voted against, and 18 abstained there. About 6 months later, Israel applied for admission to the UN, and it was admitted. And the General Assembly has this resolution which basically says that the state of Israel has said that it unreservedly accepts the obligations of the United Nations charters. And it also recalled these 2 resolutions, 29th of November 1947 and 11th December 1948. Now, those are the 2 resolutions that declared the borders, the UN borders, and also on the right of return. And the UN accepted Israel to membership in the UN after Israel had apparently agreed to accept the earlier borders and accept the right of return. But since then, Israel basically has ignored those 1947 borders. In fact, it's continued to expand its borders. It refuses to accept the principle of the right of return. And actually, it physically and militarily prevents Palestinians from returning when they try to do so. When individual Palestinians try to slip into Israel, they are called infiltrators and they're shot, and it's happened to many, many of them. But you'll remember about 2 years ago, the Palestinians said, well, maybe they can shoot us one by one, but if thousands of us go to the border, they can't shoot thousands of us. And that was the origins of the Great March of Return in Gaza. So thousands of them did come to the fence. And in fact, it turns out that the Israelis are prepared to shoot hundreds of them. In the first 4 months, 200 Palestinians were killed by snipers. And here is a picture on the right-hand side, taken from the Israeli side, looking at the Palestinians on the other side demanding their right to return. Furthermore, all the people who were driven out, Israel declared them absentees and confiscated all their property and either took it over by the state or allocated it to other arriving Jewish immigrants. So since 1947, since Israel was accepted in 49 as a member of the UN, every year UN has reaffirmed Resolution 194 and has criticized Israel for not following other resolutions as well. For example, it has criticized Israel on the path of the wall. You can see International Court of Justice finds the Israeli barrier in Palestinian territory is illegal. It has criticized the settlements. It has criticized house demolitions, the excessive use of violence. Here, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is now looking at the case of investigating Israel. Here is a map showing the growth of Israeli land in what was formerly Palestine. There's the UN plan as the second panel. This is what existed from 1967 to 1949. And after 1967, Israel basically took over the West Bank and now allows the Palestinians some sub-control on these little islands in the West Bank. Here is something I get monthly statements from OCHA, which is a UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in the occupied territory, about the destruction of Palestinian property every month. For example, in September, Jamie McGoldrick said that the period from March to August 2020 saw the destruction or confiscation of almost 400 Palestinian structures in the West Bank, averaging 65 a month. We don't hear about it in Canada because it's one a day, 2 a day, 3 a day, but it's ongoing. The result has been new settlements for Jews only in the West Bank. This map on the right hand shows these are settlements that were started in 2019. This is from a liberal Zionist organization called Peace Now. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner the growth of Israeli population, Jewish Israelis moving into the West Bank. Now, both these things are violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention on Occupation. Now, technically, they're war crimes. Now, normally we think of war crimes, we're thinking of massacres of people. That's not what's going on, but these are technically war crimes. So here's the question I leave with you, the question I've been asked to address. Why does the UN single out Israel for criticism? Is it a reflection of some kind of bias against Israel? Is it really motivated by anti-Semitism, some kind of animosity against Jews? Is it political grandstanding by other countries? I think it's possible that all those are factors. Anti-Semitism still exists. That could be a motivator. No doubt other regimes grandstand as well. That's true. But I think there are some other very important factors at play here. The first and most important, in my view, is that Israel is and has been a constant and repeated violator of many UN resolutions. So it's not surprising, therefore, that the UN would keep on voting resolutions criticizing Israel for not carrying out what the UN feels are its obligations under international law. Sometimes the second point is also particularly important because the UN has a special responsibility. There are many, many countries in the world, and the graphic on the right-hand side talks about how there's forced labor here or We know about Tibet. We know about the situation of women in Pakistan. We know about Sri Lanka. There are all kinds of countries that have terrible human rights records. But Israel is special to the UN because the UN didn't create any of those countries. Those problems existed before the UN. The UN may make commentary on them, but in the case of Israel, the UN created Israel. Now, when I say created Israel, it voted the original partition, it recognized Israel. So there's no other, I think there's only one other country in the world that basically has been created by a UN resolution, and that I believe is East Timor. So it's not surprising that the UN pays a special attention to a situation that it has had a hand in creating. And finally, and I think this is important as well, the UN itself has significantly changed since 1947. At the time that Israel was created, or the UN voted in favor of dividing up the country of Palestine and giving part of it to incoming European Jews, at that time, the UN was basically a European organization. Today, there are now almost 200 members of the UN. Many of them are developing countries. And I think if that same resolution were put to them today, if, for example, the UN said, okay, well, the Roma in Europe is a big problem, and we'll solve the Roma problem by giving the Roma part of some African country, I don't think the UN would vote for it. I don't think it could happen now. So the UN itself has changed. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why in the UN General Assembly, when these resolutions criticize Israel, the votes are overwhelming. It usually is 150 to criticize Israel, 7 or 8 support Israel, and another 20 or 30 abstain. So why does the UN criticize Israel so often? Well, it's up to you to decide, but I've put my case to you for discussion. And that's my presentation. I'm ready for questions.
Thank you very much, Peter. So now we're going to turn to the question part of our presentation. So if anyone has any questions or comments, please send them through in the chat. So we have our first question. Can you talk a bit more about the treatment of Palestinian children under the age of 18 by Israel's security forces?
Sure. There is an organization called Defense of Children International that is focused specifically on this. In the West Bank, and this is an issue particularly in the West Bank, it's less of an issue for the Palestinians living in Israel. And of course, in Gaza, the Palestinians don't really interact directly with the Israelis. But in the West Bank, with all the settlers around, there's a constant fighting going on. Settlers are expanding, and the Palestinians resist. And the children often come out and they throw stones at the Israelis. And of course, the Israelis don't like that. And so they arrest the children, and they're often very brutal with them. Any Palestinian arrested in the West Bank, is held under what's called administrative detention. So none of the rules of habeas corpus that we would be familiar with exist in the West Bank. And in fact, Israel has passed a law that throwing stones at a soldier is passable for 7 years of imprisonment. So there are hundreds of Israeli children who are seized and Palestinian children who are seized by Israeli forces and held imprisoned now today. If you want any more information, I can send it. It's Defense of Children International, and Amnesty has done quite a bit on this issue as well.
So do we have more questions? I don't see any more yet.
I see some in the chat. If you click on the chat window.
Here's one. Oh, hold on a second. Here's another comment question. So it's a bit long, so I'll read the whole thing. I'm wondering if there might also be an economic angle to UN criticism of Israel. Israel is a member of the G20, if I'm not mistaken. it is a well-off country, and yet it exercises extreme discrimination against a minority. To me, it's even more problematic if this type of country is, I guess it's cut off, but is doing this type of behavior. So do you think there's an economic angle to this?
Well, Israel is a developed country. It's a very impressive, what it's done. It's a very high-tech country. It's got fancy roads. It's very much in high-tech communication and so on. It's over there. Standard of living it's basically a European country in the Arab world. I mean, but you see, it's quite surprising when you go there. You see how European it feels. The question is whether I don't think that Canada has any important economic. It has ties. We have trade with Israel. I don't think that's an important. Our attitude towards Israel, I don't think, is mostly motivated by economics. I don't think. In some small, we buy some Israeli drones. We have some interaction with them, but I don't think that's a huge issue. One thing, though, is Israel does want to portray itself as a European type country, and therefore it's the only European type country that carries out this kind of occupation of another country. So it kind of puts itself up for criticism by saying which club it wants to join.
Okay. So I have one question here. I'm hoping I'm understanding it. One nonviolent approach maybe that Palestinians try to resist is through BDS. And I don't know what BDS means. So could you please comment on that? Do you know what BDS means?
I do, yes.
Okay. Can you explain what BDS is first?
Sure, of course I'll do that.
Okay.
So BDS is the short form for a movement to boycott Israel. It's called, the formal name is the to boycott, divest, and sanctions. The various forms of economic pressure, economic and political pressure against Israel. And so it's called the BDS movement. And that was launched by Palestinians in 2005. It's basically an attempt to turn international opinion to be more critical of Israel. I am not a member of the BDS movement. My organization is not a supporter of the BDS movement. We don't endorse the BDS movement, but nor do we criticize it. I think it's a matter of freedom of speech. I think it's quite legitimate to criticize Israel. The BDS movement itself has three main demands. One is to end the occupation, as I say, the occupation of the West Bank and of Gaza. The second is for equality for the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And the third is for the right of just solution for the Palestinian refugees. Now, as it turns out, those three demands are quite consistent with official Canadian policy. Canadian government policy is against the occupation. Canadian government policy is for equality everywhere in the world, including presumably in Israel. And it's also for a just solution for the refugees. So I feel quite comfortable supporting the objectives of the BDS movement, but I'm not a member of the BDS movement, and my organization is not. Is that clear, Lisa?
Yep, thank you.
Okay.
So one question is, where is Israel's internal politics on the rights of Palestinians? Are you aware of that?
I am. There will be there will be elections again in Israel. They've had 3 elections in the last year and a half, and basically the issue of the Palestinians has not been a factor in the elections. There is virtual unanimity in Israel that Israel is a Jewish state, that the Palestinians need to accommodate themselves to that. There is some little debate in Israel about how aggressive or not Israel should be in controlling the Palestinians, but there is unanimity basically on the fact that they should be controlled so that Israel will maintain its situation as the dominant power in the region and controlling the Palestinians. So there will be a new election, and I am fairly certain that the issue of a two-state solution or Palestinian human rights will not be a factor in the election. In fact, the last time out, the debate between the two parties presenting themselves were between the right and the right. There was no, the Israeli left has pretty well disappeared, which has caused a significant discomfort with the Jewish diaspora in America and Canada, because in general, Canadian Jews and American Jews tend to be more liberal. So there is a tension between the quite right-wing policies of the Israeli government and the right-wing consensus in Israel and the more liberal consensus amongst Canadian Jews.
So I have several people, I've got at least 3 people sending in very similar questions. So I'm going to try to put them together into one. Sure. And basically it's from some of the Unitarians that are here. And basically they're all kind of saying, look, what do we do about this? What are the solutions? What can we do as Unitarians to make any difference or to help? Because I think there's some general frustration that you know, like resolutions are doing nothing, and you know, what actually can we do? Is there anything we can do where the Canadian government can have a difference, or you know? So we want to know what we can do.
Sure.
To help move things forward.
One of the things about Unitarians that I love, actually 2 things I love about Unitarians, is on the one hand they're dreamers, on the other hand they're practical. So I like practical dreamers. I think that's a great space to be in. I think, first we have to be realistic. The Israel-Palestine issue is one of, certainly in a time of pandemic, COVID, all the other preoccupations that people have, this is a long ways off most people's agenda. That's number one. You just have to recognize, and that I think will exist for a long time forward. I can't imagine ever a time when this becomes a principal issue on the Canadian agenda. On the other hand, there are some things we can do. And I think the most important thing we can do is we need to insist that our Canadian government carry out what it says its policy is. We actually, as a country, have 2 policies on the Israel-Palestine question. If you go on their website, go on the Canadian government's website, we say, for example, that we are in favor of a 2-state solution. I don't think a 2-state solution is likely to work, but that is our position. But we do nothing about it. So when Israel builds new settlements, and another new settlement in the West Bank, or when it comes into Jerusalem and attacks the Palestinian National Theater, that goes against Canada's official policy, but we don't say anything. When Israel builds new settlements or destroys Palestinian houses, or we have policies about human rights, but when Israel arrests children and sends them to jail, allegedly for 7 years for throwing stones, we don't say anything. So I think what we need to do is we have to build up a consensus in Canada so that a member of parliament feels strong when he or she says Canada should be following its policy. You know, members of parliament pay attention to 2 things. They pay attention to how good your ideas are and how many votes you have behind you. When push comes to shove, they're much more interested in a lousy idea with lots of votes than they are with a great idea with nobody supports, because they need to be reelected. So I think what Unitarians are doing, talking to each other, talking to other Unitarians, pointing out the fact that the Canadian government should follow its policy, should apply its policy, which I think we are not doing now. We should, every time you get an opportunity to talk to your member of parliament or talk to your friends, say, listen, we say we believe in something, but let's carry it out, because we are not doing that.
So speaking of politicians, we have one question here that says, I understand there will be Palestinian elections this spring for the first time in over a decade. How will this affect the current dynamic? What do you think is going to happen?
Okay, so I'm happy to give you my opinion, but I don't know. I strictly don't know the answer to the question, but as someone who's been there some time, I'm happy to tell you what I think are considerations. There haven't been elections in the Palestinian community since 2006. People forget that when those elections took place, Hamas won. Hamas didn't just win in Gaza. Hamas won the whole shebang. They won about 3/4 of the seats. That was a big surprise to the Israelis and to the Americans. They didn't think that was going to happen. So then the Israelis and the Americans said, well, you elected the wrong guys and we're not going to recognize them. So the last time out, it didn't work out very well. Hamas folks won. Not only did they not get to take over the government, but then all their candidates got picked up, arrested, and thrown in jail. So you can imagine the Hamas people today are very reluctant to engage in an electoral process if they think that that's likely to be the outcome again. The second thing that's important to know is that there were elections for the Palestinian National Authority. But under the Oslo agreements, Palestinians have been redefined as only the Palestinians living in the West Bank. So the Palestinians living in Israel or the Palestinian refugees don't get to vote. So I think that it's very unlikely that there actually will be a vote. We'll see. I could be wrong. But I think that Hamas would be very reluctant to participate under the same conditions of trying to carry out an election under occupation. And I think the PLO will be very reluctant to carry out elections that they think they're going to lose. So I think this is talk. We'll see what happens, but that's my view.
Thank you. So I have another question here. Again, we know you don't know the answer, but we are happy to have an expert telling us sort of what you think about it. So what do you think at this point about the right of the return of Palestinian refugees? You know, is this something that is workable at this point? It's been so long since many of them were expelled. So what do you think about that topic? Is that something that will ever be able to realistically be enforced or to make it happen?
This is a very important issue, and there's not a simple answer to it. There's a simple answer in principle, in my view, and the UN has the right. Yes, they should have the right to return. They are the only refugee group in the world that does not have the right to return. I sometimes in my presentations, people will say to me, well, my parents were forced out of Ukraine, or my parents are forced out of Poland or whatever. Why don't I have the right to return? I said, well, you do. All you got to do is go to Poland. And furthermore, if your property was unfairly confiscated, you can apply the law to get restitution. That may or may not happen, but I fully support that right. And so I think anybody who believes in elemental justice has to agree that a Palestinian who was forced out has the moral right to return, and furthermore, to reclaim the property that was taken through no fault of their own. So that's at the moral level. On the other hand, and that has been endorsed by UN resolutions, but not put into application. On the other hand, everybody knows that the Israelis don't want the Palestinians to return, because if they were to return, the Palestinians would become a majority. And if they're a majority, it wouldn't take as long as Israel continued to be a democratic country, if the Palestinians or non-Jews were a majority, then it wouldn't take very long before the whole suite of rules which ensure Israel to be a Jewish state would be gradually eaten away, and Israel would take on a different character. So Israel will resist this as long as they can. And as long as Israel is supported by the West, and particularly by the United States in that, it won't happen. So I think it's justified. I think it's unlikely to happen as long as the Israelis are supported by the West. And frankly, as long as the Palestinians aren't clear on what would happen to Jews if that were to take place. The Palestinians if their solution is the Jews have to leave, well, they're not going to get my support. And I don't think most Palestinians think that, but there isn't a political party that articulates what would happen. And so I and Lisa, you would only support the right of return if you were pretty darn confident that nothing terrible is going to happen to Jews. If you thought that that might be the corollary of supporting the right to return, whether or not it's supported by international law, you say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to go there, right? And I feel the same way. So they have to articulate what their vision is. And this I give kind of an example of Mandela. We supported Mandela because we believed him that what he had in mind was not an expulsion of whites, not a massacre of whites. What he had in mind was a post-apartheid equal society. We not only believed Mandela, but we believed that he had convinced the majority of Black South Africans that that was the way to go. So we had some confidence in supporting him. And that level of confidence does not exist today, in my view.
So you kind of just answered what part of what my next question was going to be. A few people have asked questions about your comment earlier that you don't support the two-state solution, even though Canada supports this officially. Yeah. What do you think about the viability of a two-state solution? I mean, it sounds like from what you just said that you think really it has to be more like what happened out in South Africa, where it's one country with everybody having equal rights. Is that what you were trying to say?
I want to be very careful about this. First, I'm glad for the question, and I have to dance around a little bit. I don't think it's up to me or any other Canadian to say what the right answer is. This is going to be a compromise between Israeli Jews and Palestinians. Neither of them is going to get, in my view, everything they want. I'm sure most Palestinians wake up in the morning and say, oh, I wish the hell our country would go back to the way it was in 1947 and everything would be, they'd all go back to Europe and everything would be great. I'm sure that most Israeli Jews wake up and say, why the hell don't the Arabs just go away and leave us? I'm sure that those are the outlying extreme positions. I don't think either of those is going to happen. They're going to have to work out a compromise, and what compromise they work out is up to them. Now, I think that Canada makes an error. Canada says the only answer is a two-state solution. I think in doing that, we make it more difficult for Palestinians and Israelis even to think about another solution. To say, well, the only solution possible is a two-state solution. So that's my first thing. My personal view is that a two-state solution cannot resolve the problem. And there are two major issues for that, reasons for that. One is it excludes the refugees. You see, there are about 10 or 11 million Palestinians in the world. About a quarter of them live in the West Bank. About 15% live inside Israel. And the rest of them are refugees. So if you have a two-state solution, the refugees still are in Lebanon and refugee camps in Gaza, they're looking to come back. Well, they don't want to come back to the West Bank, which is mostly desert. They want to come back to where they came from, which is today Israel. And if they come back to Israel, Israel is no longer a Jewish state. So it doesn't work. So in my view, a two-state solution, there may be a deal signed, but it won't last very long because it doesn't solve the biggest part of the problem. That's my personal view. But once again, I think it's up to them to work out whatever compromise they want.
So, we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions, but there's a really good one here that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. So as we all know, in the last, 5 years or something, we observed the Arab Spring going through the Middle East, especially we noticed in Egypt. And then we want to know, can you speak about the emergence of the new or younger generations of people on both sides, such as we saw in the Arab Spring protests,
right,
and how they are expressing their ideas and actions about making change? What's their approach to all of this?
Well, I can tell you once again, superficial. I don't speak either Hebrew or Arabic. So the range of people I get to talk to are ones who speak English, or sometimes French, but mostly English. So that's pretty small subset. Well, yeah, I'll call it is a subset of the entire population. Of the Palestinians I speak to, they are thoroughly disgusted with the leadership, the current leadership of the Palestinian Authority. A little bit less frustrated. The folks I meet in Gaza are also frustrated with Hamas. They feel it's not getting anywhere. There's not, and they are increasingly talking. The young people that I talk to are increasingly talking about the end of the two-state solution, saying we need to reconfigure. On the Israeli side, I haven't talked directly to any Israeli youth, but I do see I do hear of a hardening. I think the younger generations of Israeli are more right-wing than the Labour Party, the left-wing, the liberal movement in Israel has pretty well disappeared. And so I feel that on the Israeli side, opinions amongst the young people have hardened. But that is based on very little data. I tell you what I think, but I couldn't argue it for someone who is more knowledgeable than I.
So I think, we're coming up to 10 o'clock now. So I think what we're going to do is move towards the next step of our presentation. I want to first of all thank you, Peter, for sharing your insights and observations with us today. You've really given us some food for thought. The ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestinians is very troubling. It's important for us to understand all of the issues involved, including anti-animosity against Jews, anti-Semitism, the political grandstanding by other countries that you mentioned.